we're live. I want to begin by just thanking and acknowledging all the help that I've actually received in putting this together from the people, many of whom are in this room. So thank you, all of you, for your insights and for your expertise, because really this is a group effort that I've been very pleased to, sort of try to put down onto paper. But this is something that a lot of people have been thinking about, and certainly I've drawn on your collective expertise in the production of this paper. What I'm going to talk about today is electricity 2.0. So first of all, I want to say, what do we mean by electricity 2.0? Well, if you think about it, we have inherited at this point in time an electricity system that is about a century old. And it's a system that has served the country very well. But as we look at putting in place a new, bringing renewables online and otherwise transforming our energy system, and this is something that, as you know, has excited everyone from President Obama to Silicon Valley, which has invested, I think, about $5.4 billion in it last year. It's captured people's imaginations, but we have yet to really see the job-creating and wealth-creating benefits that we think it can do. And to do that, we're proposing something called Electricity 2.0 to unlock this potential. As Simon mentioned, we've been involved, as many of you have, in all of these discussions about putting a price on carbon and so forth. But we keep coming up against the fact that at the end of the day, it all rests on the electricity system. So that's what we'll really have to focus on. Okay, first of all, I want to start by saying energy is something that we tend to think of in terms of challenges. We think of it in terms of how difficult it is, but really energy is good stuff. It's fun. If you really kind of get back to what energy is, it's kind of, in a way, it's what it's all about. First of all, it's conserved in the universe. Okay, it's kind of a special thing that is transformed from one type or one form of energy into another, but really is kind of what it's all about. It's what we run on. It's what our economy runs on. It's what any system runs on, and it's something that we want to encourage. The challenge with energy, though, is to get it to where it's needed. So I'm sure you've all heard that there's enough energy every day in the sun to power, our economy for an entire year, and similar statistics. But the key thing is getting it where it's needed and transforming it from one type of energy into another type of energy. Okay, let's see. There's a graphic here. There it is. When we talk about the wider energy network, we're really talking about a variety of networks that all feed into one core network, which is the electricity network. Now, we have a network of natural gas. Natural gas flows through pipelines. We have a network of oil, which travels around the world on tankers, and we have a variety of different types of energy networks. But the one network that kind of moves at the speed of light as opposed to the speed of a truck or the speed of a tanker is electricity. And electricity is the only network, or the only part of the wider energy network that can, for example, transfer the power of falling water in one time zone to a hospital in another time zone. It's really a 21st century kind of I won't use the word virtual, but instantaneous method of energy transfer, and therefore it's the part of the network that all of the other pieces of the energy network connects, or that connects all those different pieces. In that sense, is unique because it really does kind of underlie the entire energy network. Now, as we look at the challenge we face in electricity, it's vast by any standard. Even if we weren't talking about converting to clean, renewable energy, even if we didn't face climate change, even if we didn't have the challenge of energy security and the problems associated with lack of energy independence, we would still be looking at an immense challenge. In the United States, there will be 50 million more people in the next 20 years. That's a huge number. 20 million new homes, and according to a recent study by the Brattle Group and the Edison Electric Institute, this will result in a vast amount of new power required, a vast investment. The size of that investment will depend on the nature of the investment. Will it basically satisfy the demand on a current scenario? Will the demand or the load be reduced by virtue of greater efficiency and so forth? But any way you look at it, we're talking about a massive new investment. So I'd like to ask you to kind of imagine that we don't have all this history before us and that we're embarking on a project to spend $1.5 to $2 trillion to basically build out a huge new energy network. Therefore, the question is, will we build it out the way we have built the energy network up to this point, electricity 1.0, or will we build it in a new way, which I call electricity 2.0? Electricity 1.0, and I'll go into this in greater depth in several slides, is characterized by big power, heavy transmission requirements, and essentially it's the one-to-many network structure. And of course, if we look at all the transformation that's occurred in other networks and other parts of our economy, one-to-many was the dominant mode 150 years ago. There was one TV tower that broadcast out to everybody in a community. Their economies of scale meant that there would be one plant that would furnish whatever it was to the community. Now we see in many spheres of our economy a much more of a two-way model. So, for example, in television, rather than just everything being broadcast out from a central tower, we see people tweeting, broadcasting on YouTube, and basically see a two-way connection. Now, the advantage of a two-way connection is that the information exchange is much richer. So, on the demand side, whatever it is knows what to produce, and of course, you get the benefits of much greater participation from lots of people. So, if we look at what's happened in some of other spheres of the economy, and we remember the fact that electricity is fundamentally a network, we can envision a much more open and democratic energy network that instead of being one-to-many is many-to-many, that involves a large number of people participating, that's flexible, that incorporates efficiency, which requires information exchange, that has storage, and you can even conceive of it as involving a peer-to-peer component. So what is the electricity 2.0 opportunity? Well, in many ways, like clean technology itself, it's about creating a lot of new products and services. It's about creating wealth and economic opportunity. It's about improving energy security. But it's also about raising the quality and lowering the cost of energy. So in other words, if you look at the way traditional electricity has been delivered, it's been essentially engineered into a single featureless commodity. If you go back to the early days of electricity, electricity was delivered in various different formats to different people. It was delivered at different voltages. It was delivered either as DC or AC. In fact, some of the different, the provisioning was based on the appliance that it was going to be used for. You would provision a different type of line for a fan as opposed to machinery. Over time, we've basically settled on the common standard of AC electricity delivered at a certain standardized voltage. But in doing that, we've lost all sorts of products and services that we see in other industries. And our belief is that if we kind of unlock the potential of electricity 2.0, we will see, again, the sort of innovation in electricity that we've seen in virtually every other sector of the economy, but has dried up over the last 50 or so years. Okay, now specifically, as I mentioned, everyone is excited about clean technology, from the President Obama right on down to people on the street. We're going to see lots of commercials this Sunday in the Super Bowl probably that have a clean energy theme. But if we look at the progress that's actually been made in renewable energy, it is not as satisfying as we would like to see it. Renewable energy in the United States, if you include hydropower, is relatively significant at about 9%. But if you exclude hydropower, actual energy from wind, biomass and so forth is only about 3.5% of the total. And you can see that that coal, which is the bar in blue, is still by far the largest source of electricity in the United States. If you look abroad, as many of you know, the percentages of renewable energy in other countries are much higher than in the U.S. per capita, although the U.S. being a large country, of course, is still large on an absolute basis. But to take wind, for example, Denmark has made exceptional progress in wind, so has Spain, Germany. In many cases, this is due to very large-scale government subsidies, but it's also due to a lack of the complexity that we see in the U.S. market where we have state-by-state regulation. Now, in looking at the clean energy challenge and the renewables challenge, there's been a lot of discussion. People have focused on the antiquated grid, which has all kinds of deficits that you're well aware of. R&D by utilities is astonishingly low, under 1% on average, compared to 10% or so in a typical high-tech industry. There's been a lack of innovation, and recently many people have highlighted issues around security. For example, Jim Woolsey, you may have heard him talk about those issues. Those are the types of things that people are talking about. So there's no question that there are a lot of immediate roadblocks to renewable energy. Transmission, of course, with respect to wind and so forth. But really, the real question to ask, and the question that I ask in this paper, is why are all those problems in place? I mean, yes, we have an antiquated grid, but why do we have an antiquated grid? And if you analyze it, you realize that we have an antiquated grid because we have the grid, in effect, that we deserve by virtue of our current regulatory system. As you know, the regulatory system in the United States is extraordinarily complex. Electricity is regulated at the state and local level. It's regulated at the federal level. There are even regional, through the ISOs and RTOs, there is sort of a regional layer. It involves some international crossover with Canada and so forth. So we have a very complex regulatory structure. The regulated component of that, those states that have traditional regulation, do not reward risk. If you think about it, the idea that a heavily regulated industry will lead any revolution doesn't make sense. There is no reward for risk. So if there's no reward for risk, why would you take risk? And so our utilities have acted very rationally in doing what they have done, which is that they have not gone out of their way to incur risk. And I'm sure if you ask many people at public utility commissions and otherwise, they would say that they shouldn't take on too much risk. That's not what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to deliver power reliably without short-term price increases, and they're supposed to do it universally. But if you sort of flip that around, you realize that we are simply not going to see innovation, risk-taking, and the other components that are needed for a clean tech and renewable revolution arising out of a heavily regulated sector. Furthermore, if in fact a utility does make let's say, invest in a new technology, there's no market discipline to determine whether it was a good idea or not. Basically, under the rate of return system, as you're well aware, the utility will be compensated, if it's subject to that system, based on the amount of capital that's put into the rate base, not on the basis of the ultimate service success of that particular investment. Now, there are many economic issues associated with a regulated system. Obviously, a monopoly has the ability to charge prices that are higher than would obtain in a competitive environment, and that is moderated by regulation. However, even in those parts of the country that have partial deregulation, and you see the division of vertical division of the industry into a distribution tier and a production tier, to the extent that the utility maintains control of distribution, they can acquire a certain buying power, which results ultimately in lower prices for innovators. Now, in the short term, that's great. You use the buying power that you have to drive prices down. The problem is that, and this just basically flows from standard microeconomics theory from Micro 101, when you have less money available to producers, the producers will leave the sector. So ultimately, you get less production, and that causes prices to go back up in the long run. So the problem with a monopsony is, like as with a monopoly, is it basically distorts an economy and causes money not to flow the way it should based on the proper rate of return, but money to flow actually away from the sector into other sectors, and you end up with less production, even in that deregulated model, which is in place in a number of states. Now, obviously, utilities which have a sort of a dominant market position have a bias in favor of their existing technologies. And to the extent that their return is based on how much electricity they sell, they may prefer to sell their own electricity. They may prefer to choose technologies which are compatible with their existing set of technologies. And that results cumulatively in what you might call incumbent bias. Risk aversion is basically means like, why take risks if you're not going to be compensated for them, as we saw before. And there is a conservatism in utilities. And again, this is not to point a finger at the utilities because they are doing what they've been asked to do. But they are very conservative. And I would say that many in Silicon Valley, I mean, the rationale behind the massive amount of money flowing into clean technology is that, yes, we know the utilities are fairly conservative, but we will innovate outside the utilities in small companies, and they will sell their innovative products to the utilities. The problem is that these features of risk aversion and so forth work their way right back up the value chain, so that anyone who's tried to sell to the utilities in Silicon Valley may tell you that it's not necessarily the easiest sale because there are all kinds of things that are going to discourage them from betting on anything new and innovative, including going right back up to the concern of public utility commissioners that this might not be in the interests of ratepayers. And we saw that with the smart grid, smart meters, where although it seems like an enlightened, progressive thing to do to put in place smart meters, there's actually some pushback from people that say, well, why should we be paying for these? So what you end up in at the end of the day is with suboptimal decision making. In other words, flawed decision making. And this is kind of a prisoner's dilemma situation for those of you who are familiar with quote unquote game theory, which is that the utility can act entirely rationally, but end up at the level of public welfare with a suboptimal result. So the danger we face, really, is that the renewable revolution that I think most of us in this room are committed to, and that has actually become a central part of American economic policy, as it's discussed by the President, members of Congress, and others, will not happen in the United States with this current system. This is a very serious roadblock that we cannot ignore. In addition, the absence of real innovation in the industry to drive down prices over the long term will harm household budgets and will lower our competitiveness. I was talking last night with people at some large industrial companies who consume large amounts of electricity, and they have a real problem because they can move to Portugal or Greece and make their product for less because of the lower cost of power. Sometimes because there happens to be hydropower nearby. But we are justly worried about the fact that if we move to a more, let's say, competitive environment, somebody's electric bill might jump up. Someone's grandmother's electric bill would jump up, and they wouldn't be able to pay it. But by the same token, that if we don't do that, we're in essence putting off the problem, because the prices will still go up eventually, and over the long term, those higher prices will take money directly out of household budgets and, of course, out of business profits and harm the United States. So finally, the other danger is simply, and we're beginning to see this already, that other countries are the ones that will develop these new technologies and dominate the future. And already the United States, which pioneered things like wind turbines and many solar technologies, is not the leading producer of them. The leadership has moved to other countries. Okay, so just a word on electricity 1.0 to kind of sum up. It served the United States and the world very well in its day. There was an incredible amount of innovation up to 1907 when basically all of the modern products were developed. And then after 1907, when the rate-based system came in to about 1960, it delivered on what it was supposed to do. It delivered short-term price stability, reliability, and universal service. But essentially, when hydropower basically was fully exploited by the 1960s, you began to see the system not working so well because nuclear power prices spiked, particularly after Three Mile Island, and the rate of return system began producing more expensive electricity than was available through independent producers, which led to the drive towards deregulation. And of course, there are a number of problems with reliability blackouts that occurred in the 1960s and most recently in 2003. Okay, so what are we proposing with Electricity 2.0? We're proposing a system that is high innovation, that does not have those barriers to innovation in R&D. We're proposing a system with many more participants to permit diverse business models and multiple players. A rich ecosystem around any technology, such as you see in Silicon Valley, involves many people, many companies, many ideas, many competing business models, some of which win and some of which lose. But a rich ecosystem needs lots of players. We're also proposing that the network become less one-way and more two-way to prevent many-to-many network relationships. In fact, fundamentally, what we're really proposing is that we recognize that the electricity grid is not just a grid, which is sort of a word that sounds kind of foreboding. It's static. It's there. We're proposing a network that adapts, that's flexible, and that connects people, because that really is what we're doing with the energy system. We're transferring energy from one place to another. In that network, we need high trust, high information, rich information relationships, which are currently absent. We need to basically involve the people in this whole process. The consumer is entirely excluded pretty much under the old system. People need to be able to express their preferences for renewable power, for other products and services, the way they're able to do in healthy industries, which actually are creating large amounts of new jobs and new wealth. And that's the promise of clean technology, that's the promise for renewable energy, and it's the promise of Electricity 2.0. Okay, so what can we work with? Well, we already have many of the technologies in place today. The smart grid is obviously moving forward. We see the development of micro networks in industrial parks, residential developments. There are still many laws barring or preventing the full development of micro networks. If you have an industrial park, in many cases, by law, you cannot run an electrical line across a road if it happens to be a city road. You have to call on the utility to do that. Google's Power Meter, which allows people and similar products to track their usages within the house, is a very interesting technology. We're seeing more and more distributed solar and other generation, cogeneration. Obviously, batteries have received a great deal of attention, and generally distributed storage, rather than exclusively large centralized storage or kind of very small storage like batteries. We need a middle class of storage to kind of store stuff around the network at substations and so forth. Demand response, companies like Enernoc are doing very interesting things. And a lot of the electric car companies have recognized the fact that their batteries could be a major repository of power. We know the folks at Better Place very well, and they have a vision for that. Other people have a similar vision. But if something as simple as basically networking car batteries could largely eliminate peak spikes in pricing. But we need a new architecture, and that new architecture has to be plug and play. It has to be networked. It has to be decentralized. It has to be democratic. And one of the poster child example of a difficult project, there are many of them, is the Cape Wind project up in Massachusetts. where they've been struggling for years now to put in place a large wind farm in an area that, a state that's very green. They've had to do so over the objections, and that's now coming to a head, of people that live on the coastline there, fishermen and other constituents. But right now, our system of one-off renewable projects is extraordinarily complicated, extraordinarily slow. What we need is a way to allow you to connect, providing you meet certain provisions by default, so that we have much more of a plug-and-play architecture. So what we're proposing, how do we achieve this vision, is a big bang of sorts, which would be comparable in the telecom world to the 1996 Telecommunications Act. And to make that happen, what we are suggesting is that NDN is going to create a commission of people who are key stakeholders in this and who bring important levels of expertise in different areas together so that we can create this new framework. There has to be a parallel state and local effort because of the decentralized state and local nature of the electricity industry relative, for example, to telecom, which has become much more federalized. There should be a parallel private sector effort to see what the private sector can do to address some of these issues. Jigger, I know you're working on many of those private sector issues at Carbon War Room. Ultimately, however, we need federal legislation. So that is something that we are going to be working towards, but we recognize that's a long-term process. And all this has to work together with FERC rulemaking, harmonized state and local rules, and a general kind of a convening of a consistent and harmonized framework to create this new structure. So how are we going to get there? Well, that I just described the process. What we need to do kind of on a practical level is we need to create this new modernized network architecture. That architecture has to open up the network to more participants. It has to have plug-and-play connectivity. It has to have secure public access, trust, and those other network qualities that I mentioned earlier. I'm also very interested in the idea of promoting, and I would appreciate people's thoughts on the technical feasibility of this, but I've been told that it might possibly be possible, to promote a second wire into the home. One thing that if you kind of follow real estate and home development at all, you may have noticed that 50 years ago there were two wires in the home. There was a electrical wire running on 120 volts, and there was a twisted pair, a copper wire. Today, new home construction will have 4 to 5 new communications wires in it, some of which carry electricity. So you will have Cat6, RG6, HDMI to run all the communications devices which are now present in homes that include everything from television to audio, stereo, to home theater, to internet, and so on and so forth. In contrast, that electrical wire is still the same. So it kind of highlights the tremendous innovation that's occurred in that other unregulated space relative to the lack of innovation and sort of sticking with what we know in the regulated electricity space. But the cable and telephone companies do have the rights of way, and they already are transferring relatively small amounts of power into the home. So many of the devices that we now use actually don't use 120-volt current. You probably noticed that many of the things you're plugging into outlets have transformers on them. They're really running at 6 volts or much lower. And that amount of power can actually be carried through these low-voltage lines. So we have an incredible opportunity here, but as Simon said, this is not something we expect to accomplish overnight. This is an entirely new vision of what the electricity system can deliver. We feel that it is a critical component because we don't think that the renewable revolution and clean technology will occur unless we undertake this effort. But if we can succeed, we can democratize energy in the same way that information and communications have been democratized. We can harness the entrepreneurial and creative drive of the American people. Americans love to do things. Look how many people are selling their goods on eBay if you give them the tools to do so. The internet revolution was driven by people staying up late at night, downloading new software, configuring and tuning their computers, building websites, and basically participating in the revolution. we have not given people similar tools in the energy space. If you did give people tools so that they could go to Home Depot and begin building small solar installations and other things, I have no doubt that you would see the same sort of explosion of energy in the United States that we've seen in communications. But so far, people are not able to do that, largely because of the regulated nature of the space. So if we do all those things, I think over the long term, we will lower our energy costs by eliminating the spikes in the peaks that drive them upwards. We will create the jobs and wealth that everyone is expecting to come from the clean tech revolution, but that have proven elusive so far. And we will go a long way towards building a 21st century America. So that's basically Electricity 2.0 in a nutshell. And I would be delighted to get your feedback, because at the end of the day, this has to be a project, a group project that involves lots of people having their own thoughts, kind of working with these ideas, changing these ideas, cross-fertilization, and so forth. So I would love to take your questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Jigger.
Our online audience.
Hi, I'm Jigger Shaw, Carbon War Room. I'm curious your analogy to the Telecom Act, because I think that I think it's important to realize what the catalysts were to really take such a bold step to pass the Telecom Act, and what might be the catalyst then to take such a bold step here, right? As my understanding was that there was a major Supreme Court case that allowed the federal government to actually have jurisdiction in the telecom space that sort of gave them the freedom to do it. And I don't know whether cell phones posed enough of a risk to existing telecom providers to get them a little scared, or that's what.
That's a very interesting point. The process of deregulation of the telecom industry, as you know, was a very long and protracted, in some ways tortured process that happens to have happened before energy, but was by no means easy. In the 1960s, there was a very well-known decision called the Carter phone decision that allowed an entrepreneur down in Texas to attach a decoupling device to the network in order to connect the physical landlines world to the cellular world, which at that point was just coming on stream. The FCC gave the victory to Mr. Carter against great odds. Everyone expected that he would lose, and he was fought vigorously by AT&T at the time. 1984, Judge Green finally basically broke up the Bell network and created multiple companies. However, in that industry, it was a little bit different in the sense that you already had one gigantic national long-distance company, AT&T. And you also had the wireless, kind of development of wireless, which created a second channel and a large opportunity. I think what's going to be necessary to get the utilities excited about moving towards this vision, as opposed to worried about it, is to recognize the tremendous opportunity that's out there. And in the case of telecom, the opportunity was call waiting, of caller ID, and some services that were very expensive at first under the old rate structure. But there are similar analogous services in energy that could potentially, I believe, bring those folks on board. And once we open the network up a bit, we will see, basically the existing players as well as new players collaborating to create new ideas. But we haven't seen that kind of fertilization yet.
Reed Detchen with the Energy Future Coalition. Michael, I think that if I'm a utility executive, I'm troubled by the analogy because Ma Bell went away. And what happened was a proliferation of new players in the space who essentially ate up every bit of the business I used to be doing. And I think that there's some danger from a utility perspective that if you start to open up the network, that they become irrelevant. And so there's a tension and a creative dialogue that needs to go on here about what the future role of a utility will be in this system, and where they are going to continue to have perhaps monopoly access to the home and maintain a business model versus open this up entirely to other players.
Well, that's absolutely true, and I think that we have to recognize that we're not going to see the disappearance of any monopolies, and I'm certainly not suggesting that we should see the disappearance of all regulation. But I do think that in order for everyone collectively to take advantage of what is a huge opportunity, we do need to open the system up. And that means that there will be new opportunities created for new players, which may challenge incumbents. But at the same time, the incumbents will have an opportunity to expand their business and go from essentially running what can be at times relatively, I won't use the word sleepy, but sort of businesses that are constrained in their opportunities to enter new businesses, to do new things, and make additional profits, to businesses that do have the potential to enter new markets, provide different services, and expand their businesses. Another example I might use is banking, where originally, as you know, banking was basically regulated at the state level, and banks were barred from expanding outside those borders. The first step in the expansion of banks was that banks were allowed to go into neighboring states, and then subsequently they were allowed to essentially go national. So that was a huge opportunity for banking. So whereas there are cautionary examples, and clearly it's not necessarily easy for a large organization to adapt in response to whatever changes and rules may be in play, there's also great opportunity out there. And so we could see some of today's utilities actually expand their business and find themselves a much more larger and more successful companies. At the end of the day, though, we have to keep in mind the national interest. It's not just about protecting incumbents. It's about recognizing an opportunity, a very large opportunity for the entire country, and that has to take precedence.
Michael, Danny Marks from the Energy Action Coalition. Thank you for the presentation. It was really informative and inspiring. My question is kind of on the federal legislation that you propose as kind of being a catalyst to kickstart the system. Do you see maybe the current omnibus bill that covers a lot of elements of this as a good way to move forward on this, or do you think there's a potential to maybe break it down into something where we can more piecemeal different parts and get things started in a more kind of phased mentality?
Well, I would say that the current legislation, which the House has passed and the Senate has passed pieces of, has many very valuable components, and many of those components will be applicable to the type of, let's say, large-scale re-engineering of our electricity system that we've been talking about today. I think it's too early in this legislative session to conceive of something that would go as far as what we're talking about in terms of a big bang. But certainly this work has been going on for years, and many very valuable proposals have been put forward. What I think will ultimately be required, though, is kind of bringing many of these things together in order to come up with a consistent, harmonized, coherent vision for the entire system. And that's what the 1996 Act did, in a way. The Big Bang approach, let's say one piece of legislation that really set the rules of the road, has a lot of advantages. For one, it sets the rules of the road, so everybody knows what they are, as opposed to kind of incremental things, which people say, okay, well, it's like this year, but what will it be like next year? And we see that with certain things, uncertainty surrounding the putting of a price on carbon, renewable electricity standards, and so forth. The advantage of one piece of landmark legislation is that you set the new rules of the road, and then you free everybody to work within that system. Any other questions? Yes.
Have you followed what they're doing in Hawaii, and do you think that Hawaii might be a great place to start the open source movement?
I think it's very interesting. I mean, one of the advantages of our federalist system is that we have all these laboratories, so to speak, to try out new things. Certain states have moved further in interesting directions than others. What they're doing in Hawaii is very interesting. Texas obviously has been a leader in some areas of changing the regulatory structure, and in some ways that's an advantage the United States has, generally speaking. We can try things out at the state level. The problem is that when you do that, you can still end up with a situation where it then becomes very, very fragmented and balkanized. So I actually think the way to move this forward is going to involve federal and state and local efforts. And I think the idea of creating kind of model legislation in one state, be it Hawaii or California or Texas or whatever, or even at a smaller level, for example, in a city, could be a way to move this forward. But ultimately, it's got to go from that sort of limited area to the national level to create the national market that the U.S. really needs to move this stuff forward. And that's one of the advantages, by the way, of the small countries like Denmark, which is that they essentially have one market, and they're able to transform the whole market as opposed to doing it piece by piece, which is what we're trying to do here. When you think about it, one of the things that got me interested in this entire subject is that electricity is like light. It travels very rapidly, and yet we don't do much trade in electricity. We import the flowers, fresh flowers from Ecuador, but we're unable to transport hydropower from the west coast to the east coast, even though it could basically travel across the country within a minute. It's kind of an extraordinary conundrum that we face, and of course it's due to a combination of lack of necessary transmission capacity as well as regulatory issues. But we have an incredible opportunity to engage in trade, and as every economist will tell you, trade improves the welfare of both parties, because both parties are better able to achieve their set of preferences relative to lack of trade. So we have a tremendous opportunity here. Yes?
Christian Koshil, Trade Administration. You were just speaking about the impact of trade, and potentially how would the new open network system relate to our largest trading partner, Canada, and with their existing regulatory environment, and then also on our southern border, Mexico?
That's a very interesting question, and of course, currently the actual physical grid is tied in with Canada, and there is trade in electricity from Canada. So I think that we have to start in the U.S., but once we get it right in the U.S., then the natural thing to do is try to do the same thing, at a larger geographical level with Canada and Mexico.
Hi, I'm Gil Sperling with the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, Department of Energy. What I hear you saying is that, and if I put words in your mouth, sort of with the advancement of technology, the once natural monopoly isn't natural anymore. Mm-hmm. And now we need to harmonize new business models, structures, and regulatory structures to reflect that fact.
Yes, yes. Yes, the natural monopoly model, which was basically, I talk about this in the paper, developed by an economist named Richard Ely, who was a very prominent economist in the 19th century, one of the first of the people that created the American Economics Association. Made a great deal of sense at that time. There are some people that argue, well, it may not have been necessary to go as far towards prohibiting competition as actually occurred, not only with respect to electricity, but with respect to telecom and natural gas and water. For example, the Bell system was really created by the government as an outgrowth of what happened in the war. But over time, we've seen that the system doesn't really permit innovation. So when they imposed that system on an industry that had just gone through a fantastic period of innovation, if you go back and read what people like Nikola Tesla and Thomas Alva Edison did during the period 1870, 1970, 1907. It's just extraordinary. Tesla was experimenting with large-scale wireless transmission of power. Things like radio, radar, all these things were developed in a very short period of time. So building on all that technological progress, the regulated system was a way to make sure that power was kind of dispersed in an organized way without rival utilities digging up the streets and so forth. But as we look at where the industry is today and we compare it with other industries, we see that this is perhaps the one sector of the economy that has advanced least in the last 50 years, the one large sector of the economy. And it needs to be updated. It needs to be modernized. And we won't be able to do that under that old natural monopoly model.
Michael, I like how you look at the kind of post E 2.0 as being really run and pushed by the entrepreneurial and creative spirit of the individual and the American people, and how to get there we will need some kind of adjustments in legislation and the way the system is operating on federal, state, and local levels. But until we can get there, what can the everyday person do right now other than just try to push the legislation at different levels to make a difference in the system?
Well, at the level of policy, of course, this has to include a grassroots movement. So to the extent that the public wants to get involved in the policy process, they need to engage, and certainly NDN would love to facilitate that, but engage in the normal way through their elected representatives and so forth. At the same time, in many ways, the innovation that is taking place in this space reminds me of the early days of, for example, the internet. There are people that are rigging up solar and wind facilities on their rural properties. There are people that are figuring out how to charge, take care of their home charging using kits that can cost, $100. If you go on the internet, you'll see all the interesting homebrew, garage-scale things that people are doing in renewable technologies. So that really is the beginning of this grassroots revolution. But if you make it a little bit easier for the average person to do this, to hook their renewable system into the grid, to begin generating power, to sell that power either back to the grid through net metering, or even through a commerce system that might ride on top of the existing system, to sell it to other people, to allow companies to trade power back and forth between themselves. That's really where this thing really becomes revolutionary. So I would encourage anyone that's interested in this stuff to, first of all, learn about it, begin trying to, playing with it, because really is as much opportunity here as there was with the internet or any of the revolutions of the last 100 years, technology-wise. And by the way, in Germany, which is a country which I don't think people associate with entrepreneurship to the same degree they do in the U.S. Through their feed-in tariff system, they've turned, average homeowners into electricity generators. They've done it by subsidizing the feed-in tariff. But it shows that if people feel they can make money by producing power, save money through energy efficiency, they will do it. And I think they'll particularly do it in the United States with its tradition of entrepreneurship and enterprise. Okay, well, thank you very much. This is something that I think is revolutionary, writ large, if you will, and I hope very much to engage with all of you as we go forward with this. Thank you very much.